like to go to core school, and I said, yeah, I guess. I mean, I had no idea what it was all about, but it was a wonderful tour of duty. I really enjoyed it.
So you're sort of back to teaching at that
Yes.
point, basic teaching. You were teaching the hospital corpsman.
Right,
Yeah, and you're in San Diego, correct?
yes.
Okay. Any particular experiences to relate to that?
Well, I loved teaching. Of course, it was the height of the Vietnam War, and every Friday, we were graduating 2 companies at a time, most of the time, and the bus pulled up to take these young men, because it was all male at that time, pulled up to take them to FMF school, and it got so that I could not read the MIA, KIA list in Navy Times. Just turn the page, wouldn't read it, because I just did not want to know.
Because so many of them did go to Vietnam.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of them were killed, and I know a lot of them probably were missing in action, but I just did not want to know.
So you said Oakland was one of your favorite, or the favorite duty station. What particularly is the highlight of Oakland?
I think the highlight, other than being a good career thing, was taking care of the POWs when they came back in January, February of '73. I had the primary ward. It was this surgical ward. It was converted. One of the male surgical wards. There were 2 male surgical wards, but this one that was converted for the POWs, and then it extended into the SOQ, which was a smaller ward, but they used that for the overflow. I think that only had 20 beds, and the surgical ward had a capacity for 32 or 34, but each room, irregardless of how many beds it can have, was made into a private room.
So about how many of the POWs did you have there?
I think I would say about 10 or 12. I don't remember.
At a time, or?
At a time. We never had replacements. As they came in, we got the first 10 or 12, and we never had replacements.
Oh, so you had just about that many.
Yeah, right.
Now, did they have a lot of injuries that you had to treat, or were you?
There were only a couple of injuries. I remember one young man he was a lieutenant, had a fracture of the hip, I think. It was at least a lower leg injury. Had a fracture, and it had been repaired, but it needed to be re-repaired because it had not been done correctly.
So,
But he was the only one that had a real injury that needed to be fixed. The others had emotional problems.
how long did they stay with you?
Most of them didn't stay very long. As soon as they were able, most of them, as soon as they were allowed to leave, most of them went back with their families. The only one that stayed the longest was Ed Alvarez. He was the gentleman that was held the longest in captivity. And when he spoke at the 100th anniversary of the Navy Nurse Corps at the reunion, well, first of all, when he got up to speak, I said to myself, oh, I know him. And I was seated way over on the side, and as soon as he got up there, I said, I gotta figure out how to get to him before he leaves, because they said he wasn't going to stay very long, that he had another commitment. So I was figuring out how I could weave my way over to get to him. But he said when he was introduced that the Admiral had said they could stay as long as they wanted. So he did stay as long as he wanted.
At Oakland?
In Oakland. But he did stay, and finally the Admiral went to him and said, we really need to get our surgical ward back. You need to leave.
So he was getting himself readjusted.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that it was comfortable there for him after 8.5 years, and after having his wife leave him, it must have been real comforting for him to be able to stay there.
In 1963 is when President Kennedy was
Yes.
killed. Do you remember that? Where were you?
We happened to have the weekend off, and we had gone into Manila. And that morning, one of the Filipinos in the BOQ area where we were stationed overnight came and knocked on the door. And she says, "Your president is dead." We says, "Well," he says, "Well, we think a Cuban shot him." We thought, "Oh my gosh." Well, by the time we asked around, we found out that wasn't the case at all, that he was shot, of course, in Dallas, Texas and that. But it made quite a change. So the afternoon we went out to the National Cemetery there in Manila, to where the American Cemetery was. And a lot of the Filipinos that showed up there that day came over to us. And, "Well, we're so sorry to hear about your president." And I thought, yes, it was quite a very sad day all around. The Filipinos thought very well of him too. What a strange feeling it was to think that your president had been shot.
While you were in the Philippines, I understand that the Vietnam War.
Yes. At that particular time, it was getting near Christmas, and we had planned on a Christmas lunch. We had invited people for lunch, some of the local military people. And I happened to draw duty for the night shift. It was my job to go over and put the turkeys in the oven. I put the turkeys in the oven. An hour later, I get a call. "Ma'am, I'm awfully sorry. We're not going to be able to come for lunch tomorrow." I says, "You got to. I got the turkeys in the oven." "Why can't you come?" "I can't tell you. Somebody will call you in the morning around 6 o'clock probably and tell you." I thought, what on earth could possibly be? So I get a call. We got a patient coming into the emergency room. I went over, and the young corpsman that had come up with it, and he says, "What's going on?" And I says, "What do you mean?" He says that the 7th Fleet, which was 3 aircraft carriers sitting in our bay, are leaving. I says, "What?" He says, "Honestly," he says, "I've never seen anything move so fast in my life. These ships, all of a sudden the men were told, 'Get on your ships and get out of here.'" And I says, "I don't know." I says, I guess that answers my strange call. We'll find out in the morning." Sure enough, nobody was told anything until 6 o'clock. And then they told us they had been a bomb gone off in the Saigon area where our medical personnel were stationed, and that they were people injured, and they were going to be air evac to Clark Air Force Base, which was just north of us. Well, 24 hours later, it was a different story. Clark Air Force Base called and said, "Help, we've been up 24 hours. So he says, "Okay, we'll stop all surgery. I'll send as many of you people as I can to help them out. You take the operating room crew with you," because he says they are more experienced on wound care than anybody else. So they flew us up, the Marines did. So we arrived, and I took my corpsman, I says, "Okay, I'm sure we're going to be assigned to the surgical ward type situation." So we went over, and they said, "Yes, all this area here has been wounded." And we said, "Okay." So we went to the Air Force nurse, and what we can do. "Well, all these people need to get their baths," and she showed us where the ambulatory people were, and she says, "As you go on down the hall here towards our station, they are bedridden and they need more care." And we said, "Okay." So, all right, let's go. Yeah, the first day that the people came in, we had 3 Navy nurses come through here, and I said, "So we understood." I says, we found out their names. I says, one of them I knew, and I said her hearing was greatly impaired. Apparently she was close to the explosion when it went off. He says, "Yeah." He says, "I don't know whether that's going to be permanent or not." But he says, "Yeah." He says, "We've already sent 2 plane loads on to the States."
I went to Vietnam as a HM2 and as a urology technician, and I thought I would be at the hospital there in Da Nang, doing urology. And they sent me right out to the bush. So I was in Okinawa just for about a week. I got there December of '69, so it was kind of the holiday season, and so first part of January 2nd, I flew to Vietnam and got assigned to a combat unit. It was Kilo Company, 1st Marine Division, 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. And went out in the bush, and they had me as a platoon corpsman for a month, and then they allowed me to be the senior corpsman. So I was out in the bush for about 7 months, going on patrols, on ambushes, digging a hole every night, being out in the field for 30 or 40 days, coming back in for a day or two to get a shower and a hot meal, and going back out there. So I was medevacing and taking care of the Marines. But we certainly, you know, I had my close calls. I never had to fire a weapon, but I had it ready because I knew they were right around the corner. And there were several occasions. I mean, one time we were usually we'd stay in one spot for a day or two, at the most 3, then we moved to a whole nother spot, the whole company or the platoon that I was with. And one time we were in a pause, and I was talking to this guy. We were having a cup of coffee, so he was on the other side of me. He was having a cup of coffee, and a sniper shot around, and we hit the deck real quick, and then it was just one shot. And then when we stood up and talked to each other, I heard it out of this ear, and he heard it out of that ear. That bullet went right between us. Wow. I don't know if it was aimed at us or not, but it went right, and we were only like 2 feet away from each other. Wow. So there was, you know, several of those types of things that, and the medevacing and the patching up of people. And one time we were in a pause for 3 full days, which is very long. And as we're leaving, and you're kind of one-on-one leaving, somebody hit a booby trap that was there the whole 3 days and blew them up. And it was almost always traumatic amputees. They were survivable most of the time, but it was like, oh my God, it was such a blessing to be alive every day. Yeah, right after I graduated, so I was there in January of '76. It's very cold, and one nice thing about Navy nursing for me was being an ex-corpsman. Even the School of Nursing, it was just showing up, and there was really no big stress. I mean, it had lots of assignments and things you had to do, but it wasn't all new material, you know, especially as working as an LBN. So, and even when I showed up on the floors, you know, I knew what to expect. I knew what to do, and I was respected too, because I had my little medals from Vietnam and that I was a corpsman. You know, I had my good conduct medal on my chest, and so people knew, and the staff knew that, you know, I was prior enlisted.
You felt comfortable in your role change?
I felt fairly comfortable. It was still demanding and stressful, and, you know, very busy, and it seemed like being short-handed, and thank God for corpsmen.
So how did it feel to be an instructor at Hospital Corps School?
That was fun. Yeah, first of all, being on the podium was very different. I'm kind of an introvert, and so that was a challenge, just being in front and teaching and learning all the curriculum, and but great staff, and it was a wonderful experience. But it was, you know, being an instructor, and then we take them over. Building 26 was still the hospital, so we took them over there on their clinicals, make rounds with them, and we had all the labs. So you would do your own lab for your students, but you were also doing other labs, you know, from injections to IVs to, you know, medication labs. They're all different types of labs that they went through. So, yeah, it was a great experience.
How did you see the changes from when you were a young hospital corpsman to what you were teaching in terms of what had happened in medicine and nursing?
Yeah. First of all, I didn't say much about Corps School for me going through it. That was a strain on my brain. There was so much information to be a hospital corpsman, and a lot of studying, a lot of getting. I'd not ever studied my whole life that hard when I went through Hospital Corps School. So I knew the criteria was demanding, and it was still demanding when I was teaching that. So I was able to share those experiences with them, and that I know that's not easy, and And everything that you learn here, you're going to be using one way or another, down the road. And I was able to share my experiences. So, at the time I was a Vietnam vet, and so I got along really well with my students. And it was the diversity of the assignments that I had. I've done so many things, and the Navy's motto was see one, do one, teach one, and boy, I jumped into that in many ways, and it was always exciting. You just never knew what was going to come up next, so I was kind of a jack of all trade, master of none, but really enjoyed what I was doing, whatever I was doing.
When you got your orders to the repose, were you happy about that?
I was thrilled. I was thrilled. My mother wasn't thrilled. She says, you tell them you can't go. And I remember saying, Mom, I can't tell them I can't go. So after she realized that, that she's going to go, so it was a big thing, Vietnam and all. She was worried, of course, which is understandable, so, but I was thrilled. I really was.
And you said you were on the ship for a year? Mm-hmm. Was that standard assignment time?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And while you were attached to the ship, did you get a chance to travel, to get off the ship and get to?
Oh, we went to Hong Kong twice. In Japan, we broke down and we went to Japan to have repair work done. So I had about a month in Japan.
When you were aboard ship, what do you remember about the patients that you took care of there?
Well, I worked in intensive care, so that was a big jolt to me because I worked in the OR. And the big difference is, I don't know why they think, nurses that work in the OR can handle intensive care. That's a whole different bag. Mm-hmm. Plus, we were still using the powdered penicillin. And I remember the first time we were on the line, it took me about an hour to draw up all these medications. Because this stuff does not dissolve very well, And finally, they came up with the Tubex and stuff. But before that, it was, the stain mold, the needles were all reused again. And, so it was a challenge. I found it was very hard at first. And then finally, after 9 months being there, I got moved on to the ward. So my patients I could talk to. Most of the ones I had, a lot of them were badly injured. And we couldn't talk to you, so.
So mostly they were there because of injuries. Did you
Yeah,
have
some-
any illnesses?
No, actually, well, we did have one fellow that had a bad case of malaria. And then they were giving us those pills for malaria, and some of the patients would develop a reaction. They get a seizure, grand mal seizures, which was, kind of a little bit scary, to see things. But most of the patients we took care of, most of them we were able to save. I had one boy that was banged up really bad. They had the ENT doctor aboard. He had built a helmet to hold all the pieces of his bones of his face together. A bullet had gone through and out the other end. And about 9 months later, and he was still on the ship, and I didn't know it, but I heard this boy complaining about not getting to eat something more than Jell-O and all that, and it was the same young man. So I went over to him and told him, hey, you got the helmet off, you look good, and it'll be a little while before you have a steak, but it won't be long.
While you were on the repose, how close to Vietnam did the ship actually get? Do you recall where the ship sat? We
were in Dong Ha, Hue, Chu Lai, Phu Bai. When we first pulled in, we pulled into Da Nang.
Okay.
And but then we would rotate up. We'd go all the way up to Dong Ha, right off the coast of North Vietnam, and then we'd head back down Chu Lai, Phu Bai.
While you were on active duty, was there anything that jumps out at you as being, say, the most challenging, either career or professional-wise, that you haven't already touched on?
Well, I think it was very challenging to be the first nurse practitioner class, only because nobody knew what to expect. The doctors didn't have any clue what this was all about, and nursing service was not happy because we took up nursing billets. And so they were not pleased that they had to give up 3 billets for somebody that they didn't know what was, and they didn't have any control over. But I must say, when I graduated, one of the OB/GYN captains came up to me and said, Tina, I was really against this when you came. But he said, I can certainly see the benefit of it now. He was the obstetrician over at Coronado. And we used to go over to his clinic and run what we called PAP clinics. And we'd go over and 50 people would sign up, and there were 3 of us. And he said, I have never, I didn't realize what advantage this was. And so that was a real challenge, to be breaking ground. But it was also the greatest fun because we got to watch the residents grow up. And a lot of the people in the community now who are head of their departments were residents at Balboa with me. And it is fun to watch them mature and grow up and get to be important people. And so it was enjoyable, but it was also a challenge. I would always tell my prenatal patients that I was a nurse practitioner, but they didn't understand. They thought I was they didn't know what. They'd say, I want to see the doctor's substitute. But one day recently, in the last 5 years, I was at Immaculata going to church, and a lady came up to me and she said, you're Lieutenant Hooker, aren't you? And I said, I was Lieutenant Hooker. And she said, you took care of me when I was pregnant. And she said, I just want to tell you that my son is now a nurse practitioner. Wow. And I thought the fact that she remembered I was a nurse practitioner, but the thought that I took care of a little baby inside that grew up to be a nurse practitioner made me really feel good. When I was in Sasebo, we did not have fetal monitors. And if you did a pit drip, the obstetrician had to sit there and hold the belly to see how big the contractions were, and the nurse had to take the vital signs. But that's how much. We did not have a cardiac monitor, and we had a cardiac arrest while I was there. And we ran continuous EKG paper until they brought us, luckily there was a carrier in town, and they brought a cardiac monitor over from the carrier until they could get a jet down from Yokosuka to pick up the patient. But nursing has evolved. I don't know what we would have done, but we had an awful lot of paper on the floor.
Did the Vietnam War affect your work or any of your duty stations while that was going on?
Interestingly, probably not. Because Newport was a small hospital, we did not get, the only Vietnam people we got were people who lived in Providence. When they were sent to big hospitals, and then when they had to convalesce, they were sent to Newport. So that was the only Vietnam. But we did get one of our corpsmen back. He happened to have been from Providence, Rhode Island. And so he was sent back to Newport to recuperate. And he was kind of a chubby guy. And when we went to Vietnam, we said to him, now keep your bottom down. Well, didn't he get shot in the bottom? Oh, no. And we just could not he was infected. The wound was infected, and we could not clear it up. So finally, they decided to open it up, and he didn't have a piece of his uniform in there.
Oh. Wow.
And that was what the problem was. Huh. But he was just he had a great Italian family who.
Because there were only 29 nurses on each of 2 hospital ships. And then in Da Nang, they had approximately 35 nurses on land. So I was very fortunate to even get the opportunity to go over there.
On the hospital ship. So what did you, did they fly you, where did they fly you in to catch the hospital ship?
All the way into Da Nang.
So you flew into
the ship had already had one tour there, and I was second crew, if you will. And We went from Norton Air Force Base, Alaska, Okinawa, and then landed in Da Nang, and the hospital ship was not there. We had to go to the quarters. And then the following day at like 4 o'clock in the morning or whatever, they woke us up and said, wake up, it's time to go. Your transportation is here to get to the ship, which was cruising along the shore
So how did they get you to the ship?
by helicopter.
Was that exciting?
Yes, it was. You're still suffering from jet lag, and you're always hungry because your eating is off, and on the wee hours in the dark, boarding a helicopter and landing on the ship.
What uniform were you wearing when you did all this?
In those days, I was in dark blues. Fortunately, it was winter time. It was the middle of February, so it was still a little chilly. But it's very difficult to travel with nylons and a skirt and the dress uniform.
I bet. So when you were on Sanctuary, what was your job and role at Sanctuary?
I did med surge. They would you'd rotate around a little bit. Whatever ward was busiest, you would get pulled for that or pulled for this. And my actual title, I was also the psych nurse. They had a small psychiatric unit there, and that took very little of my time.
I'm sure being on the hospital ship, you had some very challenging experiences. Would you like to relate one of them or several of them?
Well, I like to think of the funny ones first. I get all
Sure.
choked up. I'm sorry.
That's perfectly all right.
Whoa. To preface this, I want to say that the camaraderie between the patients was outstanding. They would help each other. They were dedicated to each other, and they didn't care. They really didn't care what was the matter with them as a whole. They wanted to make sure that their buddy was going to be okay, and that in itself is very uplifting when you're in such a situation.
Did you mostly have Marines, or were the Army and Navy, Air Force?
Army and Marines, and occasionally Navy. The Marines and the Army would tease each other. If we had an influx of Marine Corps patients, the few Army guys would say, oh, they don't know how to fight, and vice versa. And one of the funniest things is that I never expected to see malaria. We studied malaria quite deeply in my diploma school of nursing, and that was the end of it. Well, lo and behold, we'd get influxes of patients who had malaria. And the drugs they were getting would often make them a little goofy, quinine psychosis, if you will. And at that time, we had rolls of cotton. We didn't have cotton balls. So we would have patients help us roll the cotton balls, very sanitary, and put him in a bath of alcohol. And this one young man, I can see him to this day. I just wish I knew everybody's name. He was doing that for us, very quiet, and a malaria patient. All of a sudden, he starts eating the cotton balls. He honestly thought they were marshmallows. And then within minutes of us stopping him, don't eat the cotton balls, he runs out on deck, just ran out, and our corpsman had to tackle him because his hallucinations went as far as he thought his mother was out there walking on the water, and he was going to run to his mother.
Wow.
And he made it, I think, pretty much so, but they had to be very careful with those medications.
I didn't really actually realize that they could be that dramatic in the psychosis.
Yeah.
That was really something.
Yes.
Yeah, so you had quite a few experiences, and there was times when it was busy, and then times when it wasn't so busy. Isn't that right?
Yes, however, I will say that 1968 was one of the biggest years of the war, the total casualties, and we would adjust our working hour. Pretty much we had one day off a week if we possibly could to write letters and do your laundry and stuff like that. However, for months on end, we would work 12-hour shifts and maybe not even have a day off. And then we were the first crew, if you will, we were out on the line for 90 days straight. And normally every month or 6 or 8 weeks, whatever, I can't remember, we would go into the Philippines. We would drive out to the Philippines to get repaired and drop patients off, things of that nature.
I think you have a picture of the sanctuary there with one of your pictures. Maybe you can show us that picture.
This is a decoupage that somebody did for me.
Oh, it's lovely. If you had it to do all over again, would you do it?
Yes, I would.
64, 65. They were starting to come in, but they were trying to send the casualties to the closest hospital to their home. And where it really hit home was when I went to Memphis, Tennessee, because Memphis was the only military hospital in a very large area. You know, we're talking about Mississippi, Kentucky, Arkansas, and all of Tennessee. We were talking about a very large area that there are no other military hospitals. And we had the patients in the halls, on beds in the halls, because it was the old hospital that was up on sticks. And getting back to Camp Pendleton briefly, one interesting happening there, that hospital was old in World War II and up on sticks. And one night I had the call, and I was in the call room up on the second floor of the hospital, and they didn't ring the phone. They came up and beat on the door, and they said, "You've got to come quick. You've got to open up one of the operating rooms." And I says, "Have we got casualties? What's happening?" And they said, a skunk walked into the emergency room, walked up the ramp into the emergency room, and one of the corpsmen tried to scare it out and threw a chair at it. And it sprayed all over the emergency room. So they had to have an operating room opened up to take care of the emergencies that came in, because the emergency room was completely unworkable until they got it cleaned up. 6 or 8 of us in the counterinsurgency school, but there were only 2 of us on the flight that left from Norton Air Force Base to Da Nang and landed in Da Nang at 2-something in the morning on the 4th of July, and the sky was lit up with mortars and rockets, and the chief nurse and another nurse came in a car and picked us up at Da Nang airport, and we had to get clear across town to the nurses' quarters, to I Corps, where the hospital was. And she says, "Don't worry about your suitcases, they'll get to you eventually." So we just grabbed our purses and what we had and got over to the nurses' quarters, where the hospital compound, and there were gals waiting up for us to greet us, and we were probably some of them's relief. They were glad to see us coming.
Were they afraid you were going to get hit with the mortars and everything?
Well, yeah. The hospital was right across the gravel street from MAG 16, the Marine Corps Air Wing. And we would take short rounds if the enemy was aiming at the Marine Corps Air Wing. Some of them hit the hospital. And so you never knew when you were going to maybe get hit. And you spent more time under the bed than on top of the bed. Well, you can see the sandbags down here, and this is where a mortar went in. Well, this is probably better. You can see, here's the operating room table, and you see the hole in the ceiling. This is where the mortar came right into the operating room. And here's the Master Chief showing the end of the mortar and the hole where it came through. So this bomb mortar came through on 12 August 1969. And various patients in the hospital were wounded, as well as the operating room technician. There were 2 of them that were wounded and left and came back to the States with Purple Hearts. And I was without people. We had 96 operating room technicians and had 13 operating rooms. Tried not to run all of them, we only had 1 nurse on duty per shift. And so we went through triage with the chief of surgery and never knew anybody's name, knew them by A, B, C, D, and E. And they were tagged. And I had my clipboard and would say, A has a right arm and a left leg, the wounds. And then I'd let the corpsman know what to get ready for. Well, basically it was a night war. They came in you know, that's when the bombing really was severe. You'd have casualties, a few during the day, but would be doing a lot of revisions or wound closures or doing other types of surgery during the daytime. But the real wounds and the real casualties were coming in at night. And the helicopters were landing, and we did have usually a hospital ship close in the area. But the helicopter pilots, especially if it was rough seas, they preferred bringing the casualties to Da Nang as to be landing on a ship out at sea with casualties
At night,
at night.
yeah.
Right.
So what was it like after you came back from Vietnam?
Couldn't talk about it. It was very, very difficult because felt that nobody understood what we had gone through. It was just different.
I've had so many experiences, met so many wonderful people. I really feel sorry for my civilian sisters who have none of that. You know, I can go anywhere around the country and visit and so forth, and it's a whole wonderful outlook of life.
It was a good career. I met a lot of wonderful, wonderful people, a lot of colleagues, doctors, corpsmen, nurses.